I'm Brian Lawrence, President of the Australian Cardijn Institute. Over the past decade or so, it has become a practice in Australia to formally commence a gathering, large or small, religious or secular, with an acknowledgement that we are living on the lands occupied for millennia by the ancestors of Indigenous Australians. The kind of words we use in these acknowledgements could be used in many other parts of the world. So I begin this webinar by acknowledging the traditional custodians of all the lands on which we meet. I also acknowledge our gratitude that we share these lands today, our sorrow for the costs of that sharing, and our hope that we can move in unity to an Australia that is fair and just for all its Indigenous peoples. It is still St. Patrick's Day in some parts of the world, including in North America. It is a day of celebration and reflection for all of us whose ancestors came from Ireland. Let us also remember the dispossession of the Irish by successive invaders from the East, and those Irish who were not dispossessed became tenants in their own land. As we know, dispossession through occupation and so-called ethnic cleansing has continued into the modern era, the latest and most brutal being in Ukraine. I will now read one of the many prayers for Ukraine. It was distributed at St. Patrick's Cathedral in Melbourne. Gracious God, we pray for the people of Ukraine suffering from war. May they be held in your loving care and protection and given the strength to endure their suffering and hardship. Transform the hearts and minds of those who perpetuate the violence and oppression. Grant wisdom to world leaders in advancing efforts toward peace. May they not be compromised by self-interest and blind indifference. We ask all this through the intercession of Our Lady of Perpetual Help and in the name of your Son, Jesus, and the Holy Spirit, now and forever. Amen. Thank you.
In our webinar today, which has been titled Signs of the Times, from Alphonse Gratry to Vatican II, which will feature talks by American philosopher Clare Adams and the Australian Cardijn Institute Secretary Stefan Gigach. We will reflect on the life and work of Father Alphonse Gratry, who was born in 1805 and died in 1872. Our focus will be on the influence of Joseph Cardijn and on the See Judge Act method that is so much a part of the lives of countless people, including Pope Francis, and is reflected in the writings of Vatican II. Our first speaker is Clare, and she holds a Master of Sacred Theology degree from Yale Divinity School and a doctorate in philosophy from the Catholic University of America. Her dissertation dealt with the foundational ethical questions in Plato's Timaeus. She was a student of Dr. Mary O'Hara from the Congregation of St. Joseph and assisted her with the translation of Julian Murray's work on the philosophy of Father Alphonse Gratry. It was the first major work on Gratry in English. And this brings us to the purpose of this webinar. And so I would like to invite Clare to speak to us now.
So it's wonderful to have already been welcomed with everybody and to see your faces. And you know our topic today, the charismatic life, scholarship, and apostolic work of Alphonse Joseph Gratry. I'm indebted to this presentation, to Stefan Gigach's website on Gratry, and to my teacher, Mary O'Hara, whose translation was released in 2020 by ATF Press in Adelaide. Originally published in 1972 on the centenary of Gratry's death by Julian Marias as La Filosofia del Padre Gratry, we now mark his 150th anniversary with its publication in English. So why Gratry and why here and now? The reason is philosophical, social, and pastoral. Cardijn's quarters in 19 by Newman and Gratry. Along with others, they witnessed to a culture, traditional and informative, positive and idealist is significant. Joseph Cardijn, the Cardijn legacy, and other notable figures in the great lay movements that followed. As Stefan will discuss later, these many movements. In Gratry, we see the impetus of the Holy Spirit in the development and practice of these movements. As a catalyst, Gratry deserves to be well known. Alike in geography, context, and vocation, the lives of these two men nearly overlapped. Cardijn was born just 10 years after Gratry died. Gratry's call to priesthood, like that of Cardijn, sprang from a commitment to social justice and to the spiritual and apostolic empowerment of youth. While so engaged, he produced scholarship of immense scope and brilliance, electrified audiences with dynamic preaching, and stamped his generation. The impact of both men in recognizing the work of the church, affirmed later in Vatican II, link them intrinsically as powerful collaborators. What they began remains vital today in the movements flowing from their inspiration and direction. I'd like to put up a few slides here, and maybe Tony, I don't know what I need to do that.
Okay, Claire, go to the share screen at the bottom, the green button.
Oh, thank you. Okay. All right.
Yep, you're right.
Okay, thank you. My purpose here is to show Gratry's transformative experience of God. The slide is of just his historical context. Gratry's experience of God and his near mystical conversion as the source of all that followed. To trace 3 key points in his philosophical thought, which present human beings as rooted in nature, connected to one another, and called to a divine destiny, and to name some final issues confronting his heritage. Gratry's life and experience of God. Gratry was born in Lille in northern France, just 68 miles from Cardijn's birthplace near Brussels, a little over an hour on modern roads. Although his family was non-religious and only culturally Catholic, Gratry was baptized as a child. He had a happy temperament, a loving upbringing, and positive nurture. He lived, however, in a time of endless revolution. When he was 10, the industrialization of France began in force with its social displacements and a drastically altered economic system. When he was 16, Napoleon died, and succeeding decades saw monarchists, republicans, and the working poor pitted against each other in bloody strife, as in the revolutions of 1830 and 1848. To appreciate the enormous scope and impact of Gratry's future life in this context, we need to note his early experience of God and later conversion. In a private journal published after his death, Gratry tells of his first serious recollection at the age of 5. He says it was a powerful and profound impression of God that took the form of an experience of being. I quote, "I repeated, transported, I am. I exist, being, to be. A penetrating light, which I believe I can still see, enveloped me. I saw that being is beautiful, happy, lovable, and full of mystery. I still see, after 40 years, all these interior facts and the physical details that surrounded me. Having grown to adolescence, unengaged in formal religion, never having spoken to a priest, and with a vivid contempt and horror of churches and priests, Gratry began study at the Lycée of Henry IV at an age in which most young men lost their faith in the atheistic spirit of the times. Gratry's struggle had a different effect. At 17, he underwent a series of interior adventures, as Julian Marias terms them, that precipitated his conversion, and which Gratry details in the same private journal. In vividness and transformative power, his account stands with the great conversion stories of history, like that of St. Augustine. Details are available to the reader in Gratry's philosophy mentioned earlier. Here is a brief outline. The first intimate adventure was of life and death. In a profound, near mystical imagination or vision, Gratry saw his life in all detail unfold with growing happiness until filled with all possible joy of earth. Then a black cloud blocked all light, and he encountered his deathbed, struggling to die, dying and gone. God, he says, made me see, taste, and sense death as he had made me see, feel, and taste life. It is impossible to express with what truth I saw death. He experienced the nothingness and meaningless in human life, the depth of which 20th century existentialism speaks. Tossed between an abandonment to absurdity or an automatic appeal to a God, both of which he found inauthentic, Gratry cried out, "Oh my God, my God." In that cry, he felt he had not cried in vain. He emerged from despair, certain that truth existed and that he would consecrate his entire life to it. Here we recognize the radical human need for meaning and purpose and the desire for adequate good as the fundamental reality of human nature. Thomas Aquinas calls this voluntas ut natura, nature as will, the most profound drive of the human soul, the thrust of finite being toward the good. His next adventure was of annihilation. He experienced his body cooked by an evil fire, in pieces, degraded, disintegrated, his reality gone. The following year, Gratry had his first contact with a serious, sincere Christian of living faith, a classmate. Under his influence, Gratry decided to seek a confessor. Shortly after having revived his Catholic faith, he received communion and underwent a third experience that left its mark forcefully on his theodicy. This third interior adventure followed his first reception of communion, which failed to bring the hoped-for effect. But 1 hour later, he encountered a violent storm in his being, a combat between pure light and absolute darkness, between faith and unbelief. That was perhaps, he says, the most solemn moment of my life. I had to choose by my liberty alone. While he leaned toward radical unbelief, a difficult but free movement of mind and heart, almost imperceptible, inclined him to the other side. Transported and stretching out his arms to God, he said, "It is you whom I desire." It was his last serious temptation against faith, and it determined the future course of his life. Gratry went on to study at the distinguished scientific institute, the École Polytechnique, resolving to devote himself to the study of science, with the idea of using his knowledge in the defense of religion and the apostolate of truth. He completed a doctorate on the scientific method in Strasbourg and was ordained a priest. Later, he obtained a doctorate in letters and 2 further degrees in theology. Still, with this extensive learning and achievement, he chose to devote himself to the education and spiritual guidance of youth, teaching in high schools, seminaries, and working as a chaplain. Student accounts of his life and death witness resoundingly to the depth of his faith, wisdom, and amazing, immense kindness and charity. Revealing of this thrust of Gratry's vocation and his integration of spirit is the fact that it was in the revolutionary year of 1848 that he published his first work, an original social catechism, a systematic response to the needs and moral obligations in society. A few years later, in a parallel initiative to that of John Cardinal Newman in England, he relaunched the Congregation of the Oratory in Paris with Pierre Petitot. He became famous as a distinguished logician, theologian, social thinker, outstanding educator, publishing some 30 major philosophical works in the 1850s. He taught moral philosophy at the Sorbonne, served as chaplain in the French Senate, and the French Academy recognized his genius with election to a chair held a century earlier by Voltaire. Part 2. Gratry's philosophy of the human person in beautiful and systematic writings include a critical history of philosophy and volumes on the knowledge of God, the knowledge of the soul, and a metaphysical logic. He claimed that he was only expressing the golden thread of the whole tradition, but he stands among major figures of the 19th century as the greatest Catholic one, and in contrast to most, a holistic thinker. Whole as incomplete, whole as reflecting integration of mind, body, and consciousness. I will focus here on his analysis of the human person, fundamental to his thought, for it is here within the dynamic of individual consciousness that Gratry uncovers evidence of the rootedness of the human being in God. First, some historical notes. 2,000 years of Greek science and philosophy elevated by Christianity had produced a well-rounded view of the human person, rooted in nature and destined for eternal life. Classically and scientifically educated, Gratry was heir to this tradition. A little more than 150 years before Gratry, however, this tradition, used by the fathers of the church to formulate doctrines of the Trinity and Incarnation, was displaced by the work of René Descartes and his successors, who sought to begin philosophy from scratch, apart from it. Descartes defined human beings as dualistic, primarily minds, and only secondarily bodies, somehow linked. Here began an idea, soon to be implemented in fact, a modern alienation of the self, mind, and soul from one's own body and from consciousness itself. Evident in the wokeism of the 20th and 21st century and the addiction to the world of social media. This definition evolved to dominate intellectual life, including the social sciences, and in our day, public education, global politics, and life issues in a detrimental dualism. For example, when I asked my college students to name 3 important aspects of human nature, they immediately named the mind. It took a great deal of prodding to get them to include the body, and rarely did they include emotions. This astonished me, but the causes were clear. In face of this dualistic turn, Gratry reclaims a complete view of human nature. At its basis, he articulates in a profound and systematic way the notion of an innate, threefold human sense: an external sense, which connects us to nature; an intimate sense, the sense intime, which connects us to self and others; and a divine sense, which intuits the existence of God. These points serve as an introduction to his philosophy of the person. Sense, as the first power of the soul, implies the other 2 of mind and will. Plato and others term it simply the soul. The soul feels all that is, everything that acts upon our sense. It is sense that grasps the threefold mode of reality: bodies, soul, and God. This sense is instinctive, obscure, passive, but it is the primary, original organ by which we receive reality. Because we have sense, we can know and will. The majority of philosophers have noted this function, but without describing it sufficiently. First, the external sense. Gratry claims we have this external sense by which we grasp the natural world directly. As part of nature, the environment is our home. Aristotle explains systematically in De Anima that sensory knowledge is first in experience and first in obtaining intellectual knowledge. But dualism places human beings over and above nature, and succeeding industrialization, unlimited by the awareness of who we are and our primary human needs, has degraded this natural home and our relationship to it. This alienation is so great as to merit an encyclical by Pope Francis. In Laudato Si, he strives to reclaim the truth that we are part of nature and must see, judge, and act accordingly. Gratry and Cardijn saw this. The second innate sense, the sense intime, is of self and others. Gratry asserts that we sense the self of others directly. It is not a question of seeing them only bodily. By this intimate sense, I feel my neighbor as a thou in a primary, radical, and original way, as much as I do his or her body. And in the same way, I sense myself in an intimate, direct, and absolute mode. This is an unassailable internal experience. But the dualistic view stumbles here. If we are only minds, how can we know directly that we are connected? And if connected, how can we allow for behaviors that result in not seeing or not recognizing others as such? Who sees those entrapped in mines, factories, pollution, dying in the streets or subway tunnels, the unemployed, until a Gratry, a Cardijn, a Mother Teresa takes notice? Unless we grasp consciously the full truth of our being, we do not see or recognize our neighbor or ourself, judge them adequately, and act according to their truth. Gratry's third sense identifies as the core of his life and thought. It is the innate, intuitive sense of God. Gratry asserts that we have such a primary intellectual intuition upon which human beings have always acted. The greatest minds in Western thought argued to such existence for over 2,500 years. C.S. Peirce, a great American logician, and he posits this as the spontaneous basis for formal induction and deduction regarding the existence of God. God of the 20th century embeds it in her philosophy. Gratry argues that these three senses, as innate, show systems, laws, and institutions that disallow their integration to be radically violent and oppressive. The first two senses, along with the intuitive sense of God, as connatural to human beings, provide a solid basis for seeing the world of nature, oneself, and others in solidarity. Reclaiming them in theory and in practice restores the full truth of human nature. This vision brought hope, direction, and vitality to the youth whom Gratry taught and guided, as it did to oppressed workers under Cardijn's influence. Identifying these three innate senses is crucial in the modern world, but Gratry does more than name them. His analysis of sense in relation to human consciousness reveals an existential dynamic at work within each human being. As later 20th century existentialism discusses it, but incompletely. This innate sense finds its rest in the divine ground of being by natural faith and provides the essential predisposition for supernatural faith. Gratry examines consciousness with a method somewhat analogous to that of Hegel. He shows that the absorption in the natural world in relation to our desires pleasures, and goals proves itself in conscious experience as inadequate to satisfy the desire for happiness. Further, such unlimited pursuits result in devastation even of the environment. Driven by desire, the individual turn towards seeking satisfaction within self or others likewise comes up short. All is all is finite. Our desire is not. This realization within consciousness brings one face to face with a sense of the unlimited, the natural sense of God, natural faith. Here is a place of rest for consciousness and the source of integrated living in relation to nature, self, and others. Gratry's analysis of sense is the foundation of his subsequent work. In his book, The Logique, he reclaims and develops the complete science of intuition that began with Plato in Republic 7. This science goes beyond the processes of induction and deduction. Many who refer to Plato's science fail to understand it adequately, but Gratry sees and expounds it clearly. In his Logique, he uses a well-accepted argument from math about the infinitesimal calculus to illustrate by analogy how we reach an ultimate intuition of God as an infinite good. This ultimate intuition forms the basis of his complete metaphysics of soul, life, and law. Part 3. Issues affecting Gratry's heritage. Gratry faced 3 issues close to the end of his life that have all but obliterated his memory. First, after a life surrounded by needless violence, he joined the International Peace League, newly formed, on the eve of the Franco-Prussian War in 1870-71. A movement sorely needed in face of the conflicts in Europe, which were on a trajectory toward 2 world wars. Because of the charged nationalistic spirit in France, however, in face of the German threat, his effort was considered unpatriotic, and he was rejected as a citizen and a person. Secondly, prior to Vatican I, he opposed an overly broad definition of papal infallibility amid the controversies surrounding this doctrine. Gratry argued that the pronouncement of infallibility should not be isolated from the teaching of the bishops, from the teaching authority of the bishops in union with the Pope. For this, he was ostracized from his prominent place in ecclesial circles. The great Catholic thinker and apostle was vilified as un-Catholic. Shortly after, however, when Vatican I proclaimed the doctrine in 1870, he fully embraced the narrower formulation in obedience. It took Vatican II to complete the teaching he had vigorously defended, but Gratry did not live to see this. Instead, he took ill with an excruciating cancer, likely brought on by this pragmatic period, and accusations about his Catholic faith and his loyalty, and he died shortly after. A third issue concerns the bedrock of his metaphysics, of nature, human beings, and God. His contemporary, Auguste Comte, a French social scientist and philosopher, who like Gratry had attended the École Biblique Polytechnique, introduced a theory of positivism to bring the force of reason to bear on social ills. Other people expanded this theory to include all intellectual life, and it took hold in the scientific tenor of the age. According to this expanded theory, empirical science now held the key not only to the renewal of all social institutions, but to knowledge itself. Positivism as a theory replaced metaphysics, ethics, and theology. What was not capable of being tested by the empirical method came to be judged meaningless and without intellectual substance. Under the impact of positivism, which took over like a tsunami and relativized political and moral issues, Gratry's great works were consigned to near oblivion after his death. Critical thought has shown the inadequacy of positivism as a universal theory of knowledge, but its fallout continues to dominate intellectual life as the lifeblood of secular American and international institutions, conditioning all quarters of society, importantly in the field of education. Only one of Gratry's writings, titled Les Sources in French, The Wellsprings in English, remained wildly popular and survived up to World War II. This widely read and reprinted work has two parts: a plan of studies and a plan of life. The plan of life provides an immediate contact with Gratry's spirit and work. By way of conclusion, let's look at a few passages. Gratry writes, "I ask of you, do you will to be good? Do you mean to be the person of goodwill for whom God longs? Are you willing to devote your life to justice and truth? Are you willing to accomplish man's true mission on earth? Would you be proud to become a servant of others, a worker for God? Would you be ready to follow out with vision and resoluteness man's end, God's work?" And from his book on La Morale and Morality and Law, the history, he writes, "What matters to me, I want no one to die of hunger. It is the freedom in every soul, moral freedom, that alone can give us social freedom. But for that, it is necessary to make the will for justice enter into a great number of souls. The science of justice, love for humanity." Could we not all base ourselves on this evident principle of eternal morality, of infallible and universal religion? To be kind to one another, to be just to one another, to have pity on the vast multitude that suffers, and to be willing to wipe away so many tears. Is not that morally evident and necessarily true? Would not that constitute an unshakable basis, a starting point that is simple, solid, and universally accepted? With the inadequacy of empiricism to deal with alienation, violence, and human need today, Gratry's work is coming to the fore. In 2006, the colloque Gratry, marking the 200th anniversary of his birth, took place in the French Senate building, where Gratry once acted as chaplain. Stefan's website has links to his life context, primary and secondary works, many of which are being translated into English. Julian Maria's La Filosofia del Padre Gratry has had reprints in rapid succession in Spain, witnessing to recent interest and need, and is now available in English. other writings are being translated. Gratry himself saw his writings as several decades ahead of his time. Evidence and experience from the work of Stefan suggests he was correct. Thank you very much.
Wow, that was great. Thank you very much, Claire. Beautiful presentation. I'm going to have a hard time to follow up with that. But anyway, fortunately, I've got a bit of a break to do so, and also to give everyone here a bit of a break too. Tony, I think you're going to organise us into a few minutes of little breakout groups so that we can kind of absorb some of what Claire said and maybe kind of prepare ourselves for the next onslaught by myself. You're on mute, Tony, I think.
Yes. Yeah, look, what we'll do is we'll just go into groups to say hello to each other and really do some of that connection and kindness to each other. And maybe just share a little bit of, how do you respond to that input? And perhaps start to think, there's a Q&A session. We'll have about 10 minutes for Q&A after. So we'll do 5 minutes. And while you're doing that, you might like to shake and rattle and roll a little bit to give the body a chance to catch up with the mind. So we'll just go into groups. Hopefully we'll all get there. Don't forget to unmute when you go into your group so you can have a conversation with each other. I'll try and put about 4 people in each group. We've got a good crowd here today. So we'll just see how we go. Hold on to your seats and I hope no one falls off.
Quick comment that you were stunned by your students not being able to recognize the body. In one of the, I just, you know, as I get older, I kind of feel like I'm getting to the point where I'm stunned by many things too, and yet I am trying my best to follow Pope Francis's call to really listen and really encounter the youth of our parish as we, you know, do that. And I think that the See Judge Act has been incredibly helpful to me, and I think them as well. So it's just my comment.
Thank you. Thank you.
So just a few words about Stefan. He grew up in Melbourne, and while at uni, he joined a YCW group and later became a full-time worker for the movement. And he served the movement in cities of Melbourne, Brisbane and Sydney, and later went on to work for International YCW. His studies at university focused initially on law, which led him to work for a time as a personal injuries lawyer and to completing master's degrees in canon law and legal theory. But it was his passion for the place of YCW in his life and in the society in which he lived that led him to work on his doctoral thesis on the role of Joseph Cardijn at the Second Vatican Council. He was awarded his degree in 2020.
Yes, well, look, in fact, all I can really do after Claire's presentation is indeed a commentary on that wonderful presentation from Claire. I'm really kind of humbled and proud at the same time to be able to follow Claire's talk, because she really has given an incredible introduction to the life and thought of Gratry. So my purpose here today really is to show a bit how some of Gratry's thought had an influence, despite everything that happened at the end of his life, did have an influence, which you can actually trace directly, I believe, right through to the Second Vatican Council and even beyond. There was a French sociologist, Emile Poulat. He talked about filiation, and he used to say that the difference between physical filiation and spiritual or intellectual filiation is that intellectual filiation passes from son to father. And I think that's very true in the case of Gratry, because if you look at this list of people I've got on the screen here, you'll see each one identifies either directly with Gratry or with the person before them. And you can really see a direct chain of thought that has travelled over the 120 odd years since Gratry's life, or actually it was less than 100 years at the time of Vatican II, but nearly 100 years his thought penetrated the thought of people around the world. And you see some very, very important names there. Frederick Ozanam, who we'll speak about in a moment, Boris Blondel, sometimes called the philosopher of Vatican II, and of course John the 23rd and others as well. But from the point of view of the beginning, one of the very striking things, I'll just mention it, is most of the people, the French people that I'm going to talk about today, and also Gratry's life, was in a very small space. I don't know if for some of you who might have been to Paris or know Paris a bit, you might know the Church of Saint-Sulpice. And if you actually study there, you'll know it's very near to the Catholic Institute. And you'll see all the different centres where Gratry's life was focused. Stanislas College, where he taught, the Sorbonne, also where he taught, and also where he was chaplain at the Senate and the École Normale Supérieure. They're all actually literally within walking distance. And in, of course, 19th century Paris, there were no cars on the streets to frighten you, and it was really a much more convivial sort of environment. So actually, I think that was a really important dimension in the way his thought actually penetrated the environment in which he lived his own life. So what I'm trying to do here is trace a few of the things. Claire has mentioned his formation at the École Polytechnique, which had a profound, not obviously a religious influence. It was an elite engineering school for the military. So they're on about trajectories for ballistic, things like that. So, but the interesting thing was they had a very strong focus on the scientific method. But one of the things that kind of I found very interesting in terms of Gratry was that he drew a lot on the English philosopher of the scientific method, Francis Bacon, who described a three-step method based on description of facts, followed by categorization of the facts, and then a sort of an analytical step, rejecting what's not connected and determining what is. The thing was, Bacon had a three-step method, and we're going to see how Gratry also developed that, or what came out of Gratry's thought also was very much of a three-step method. But the thing is if we look at that scientific method that he learned, it was inductive method. And as we know, the inductive method begins with a set of empirical observations, looking for patterns in those observations and drawing theory from those patterns. If we look at the deductive method, it can never go beyond the initial postulates. Whereas for Gratry, the inductive method, and it had a transcendental dimension. Somehow, whatever we start from in our inductive method, we find something more. And this is in a way the space in which God speaks to us in our lives and in our, inverted commas, discoveries or the creation of something new. So he was very kind of strong on this idea of this kind of concept of an inductive method. Now I'm going to mention one of his very early friends at the École Polytechnique was a guy called Frederick Laplay, who actually ought to be much better known among Catholic circles, especially Catholic social teaching and Catholic social practice. He studied with Gratry and also went through this scientific method. He became a mining engineer and also saw all those terrible conditions that, even children were working in those coal mines across Europe, that actually Laplay was responsible for the construction of those mines. So that inspired him too to become a social reformer. And what he did was he basically took up that scientific method that he learned at the École Polytechnique and turned it into a sociological method. He called it la méthode d'observation sociale. And he developed that further into a three-part kind of, there were three parts to the method, starting with the facts, the empirical thing, looking at the principles, and he also had a very empirical approach to principles. He didn't look for principles in the Bible. He looked at those principles in the communities in which he was studying. And then based on those facts and those principles, he tried to look for solutions for those social problems. This had a huge impact right across the rest of the 19th century, including particularly among Catholic social circles, and including also on Cardijn. If you look at Cardijn's early writings, you'll see very much imbued with this inquiry method, as it became called, from Frederick Laplace. But the thing is you see how Laplace starts to turn a scientific method into a sociological method, making him what he is, an important sociological pioneer. Now, what Gratry did, and I think Claire also, the way she presented it, really kind of emphasizes this. Well, this is how one of Gratry's disciples, Leon Ollie Leprune, explained it. Gratry signals the hideous wounds of society. He enters into the precise living detail. He names things by their names. He explains what they do, and facing these poignant realities around us, he provokes reflection, examination of conscience, and resolution, which goes a long way in sparking and preparing many changes. So actually, I think here we can also see an echo of that three-part sense, intellect, and will that Claire mentioned earlier. Senses help us to grasp reality. Our intellect helps us to reflect. But through our will, we must decide what we're going to do about it. But the interesting thing here for me is, from Gratry, is how whereas Laplace thing is very much focused, kind of not in a deterministic way, but the focus is on the social problem. Here, Gratry is moving to the personal. So it's what I see, it's what I think, and what I'm going to do. So this is, I think, a very big transition not more than a transition, but an addition to the Laplace sociological method. As I've said, and as Claire has also mentioned some of these things, his whole approach was a very person-centered approach, existential almost. Again, maybe 100 years before others spoke of it, looking at the purpose of life, what God's asking from each person, and how God's orienting each person to what their role is in what Gratry called the salvation of the century. So therefore, if he's talking about this salvation of the century and each person's task, how do you do that? And this is where he's also had a prophetic dimension, I believe. His method, of course, biblical, was to read the signs of the times. And he was certainly one of the earliest to use that expression in the sense that became used later by John the 23rd and was taken up at Vatican II. And by reading those signs, Gratry said, people could identify the path to renew the world in line with God's vision of truth and justice that Claire also mentioned earlier. And around all of that, he built this philosophy that has also been explained, a holistic philosophy. People already recognized in that time that it was an integral philosophy, which in a sense foreshadows what Pope Francis has also called integral human development, but also the truth, the aspect of truth, which is also fundamental to Gratry's thought. Again, a very Platonic sort of approach, seeking the truth with your whole soul. And he rejecting that dualism, that Cartesian dualism that Claire also explained earlier. He, in a more Augustinian way, he emphasized the continuity between the temporal, between our life now, and the eternal, that is, what our life is to become in the fullness of time. His question was, why do we insist on separating the double idea of my dual goal? Why do we insist on separating our earthly goal and our heavenly goal? Why not grasp the link between the two? To beautify is the word he used, to beautify our terrestrial goal in perspective of what is awaiting us from a heavenly point in heaven in the end. Now we'll see how some of these ideas were carried forth. The first place he brought some of these ideas, perhaps not in the fullness of what they later became in his writings, but as principal of Stanislas College, as an educator, one of the first things he did, or one of the early things he did, was to recruit the young Frederick Ozanam, who's known to us today as the founder of the St. Vincent de Paul Society, but also a very profound thinker and activist on social justice issues of the time. So between the two of them, they developed within the school a very progressive social reform ethos that actually lasted well beyond the actual short period of time that both of them taught at the school. And another aspect of that was very important for the Stanislas College, which was actually people talk about a K to 12 school. This was actually a K to university school, from kindergarten literally up to a undergraduate degree. So the philosophy that emerged out of that Stanislas College was a much broader philosophy, not narrowly scholastic or Thomistic. So again, it very much foreshadowed what came later in the lead up and after Vatican II. Very, very significant is that one of the teachers there in the 1890s was Maurice Blondel, later recognised as the philosopher of Vatican II, and also Marc Sagnier, one of the famous students from there, who developed a democratic movement called Le Sillon, or in English, that means the furrow, of the importance of which we'll see very shortly. One of the important, he never actually taught there, but one of the important people that was inspired by Gratry was Leon Ollie Leprune, who I've already quoted. Ollie Leprune taught at the École Normale Supérieure, where Gratry had been chaplain earlier, and he was one of his greatest disciples, not only of Gratry, but also of Ozanam. In fact, even in that time, he was called sometimes the new Ozanam because of his commitment to social justice and social action and reforming the social problems that existed. Very weirdly enough, in that map I showed you, he actually lived in the same building as Frederick Laplace. But again, as I've said earlier, Laplace's approach was much more of a sociological approach. Building on Gratry, Leon Ollie Leprune took it in a direction of virtue ethics. Aristotle said, political leaders need the virtue of prudence, learning how to look at what's happening in the place they're governing and analyse it and then make their decisions. You can see there the 3 steps. And this is what Ollie Leprune reinterpreted in the line with Gratry in his famous book. Well, not famous in English, unfortunately. It's never been translated. Le prix de la vie, the price or the price of life. Each person must apply themselves better than ever to consulting courageously and faithfully the principles and the facts in order to make themselves better than ever capable of seeing clearly, judging and deciding. So, it's just so clear. I call Ollie Leprune the philosophical father of the See Judge Act. And you can see there exactly why. Now, actually, he presented that philosophy, as I was going to say, he was very close to the Stanislas College, even if he didn't actually teach there. And he presented in the end of 1893 at their graduation ceremony, he presented a talk expounding this theory that young people have this duty to go into the world and to see and to judge and to act to improve it. And a group of students were directly inspired by what he'd said in that talk. And one of them was this young guy called Marc Sagnier, aged 20, who launched a study circle in the basement of the college, what they call in French, La Crypte, and it became the name of the group, to study all those social problems and to try to do something about them. And you can see in 1898, the way he explains that by that time he was already out of the college, but he continued. Every citizen, 1, must know the state of the country. B, when the situation is bad, he must judge it, must look for solutions. And lastly, having found the solutions, he must act. And from those ideas, from Ollie Leprune's ideas and that inspiration from Gratry, and also Laplace, we have to give credit to Laplace in this as well, they developed a movement based on the name of their magazine, which is called Le Sillon, which means, as I mentioned, the furrow, which became the prototype of the YCW, the JOC, and the later specialized Catholic action movements. In fact, they specifically, they knew what they were doing. They specifically said, they called it their method of democratic education, and they claimed to be turning Laplace's sociological method into a method of promoting democratic virtue through, they didn't actually use the phrase see, judge and act, but that was the way in which they did it in the groups, in the study circles that they promoted all over France. Can't go into the history of the Sillon, but this is where Cardijn got his ideas from. And it's very, very interesting. If you look at him, as he said straight out, he wrote a paper at the end of his life saying where he got his ideas. He says Gratry, then Ollie Leprune, Le Sion, and he also names a few others. So it's very, very clear. And the first people that young Joseph Cardijn, when he came to work in a parish in Brussels, the first person he linked up with were people who had actually already had that formation from the Sion. There were actually some groups already in Belgium at that time, and Cardijn basically brought them together to work in the parish where he was working at Laken on the outskirts of Brussels at that time. And you can see again, by 1922, they've articulated that. The first step, based on the social inquiry. Second step, judge that in the light of principles. And the third requirement was to move that into action, which became what we know today. They articulate even more precisely in the next 5 years, 6 or 7 years, to see the facts, their situations, the challenges of their work, their future, their life, to judge whether those facts are a cause of happiness or unhappiness, whether they're in conformity with human destiny and Christian life, to the doctrine of the church and the divine will, and then to act individually and collectively so that their work, their life, and their milieu would reflect the happiness of the people and the glory of God. This is where, and from where, what we now know today as the See Judge Act, the practice recognised, the social encyclicals of the church, all came from. However, it sounds very easy when you present it like this, stage by stage. Well, it's in no way was it easy. It was an absolute struggle. Many people couldn't come to grips with it. They criticised it, as they said also about Laplace's method. They accused it of being a sociological method of playing down the gospel. And there was one, for example, I'll give this very clear example of a Jesuit priest called Victor Honnet in 1926, was reacting to the point of writing a book about it, proclaiming his idea, which was doctrine first. His book, the title of his book was Social Study Circles based on Catholic doctrine. This was a traditional idea that we start with what the church teaches and we apply it to the world that we live in, the doctrinal approach. And in his book, it's very interesting. He criticizes what he calls the false empiricism of the Sion movement. It's extremely suspicious. And he also links it very clearly with pejorative references to Gratry, along with several other left-wing Catholics, is his expression, including Ozanam and Ollie Leprune. For Honnet, these was all left-wingers, reductively turning the Catholic doctrine, reducing it to a sociological method. Now, this is the date of his book was 1926, just exactly the time when Cardijn and the Jock are articulating their See Judge Act method. And even though he doesn't mention Cardijn's name, it's interesting to ask why. Perhaps because Pope Pius XI had already approved Cardijn the year before. But he doesn't name Cardijn, but it's very, very clear that what the whole book is not only it's an attack on the Cardijn method. At the same time, you also have to admit that it's a defense of his method, which is based on the teaching of Catholic doctrine. So what happens when this happens? This is an attack on Cardijn's See Judge Act idea. He goes for his defense. He has to mount a defense. And he did actually articulate that progressively over the next few years. But the classic expression of it came in 1935 in a talk called, and it's still the classic, if you want to read one thing by Cardijn, read this article, The Three Truths. And just look at what I put on the page there. Total Gratry, truth, that emphasis on the truth. Seek the truth. Seek the truth in the faith, seek the truth in our experience, and seek the truth in what we do. The three things. And out of that, we link it to the eternal and temporal destiny of each young worker in particular and young workers in general. 3 times he mentions this, the Gratry idea of linking the eternal and the temporal, contrasting that truth of faith with the truth of experience that exists in the terrible conditions experienced by young workers. And the need for a method to do something about that, which method he defined and explained as the See Judge Act, to transform not only one's personal life, but also the social dimension, the environment, the milieu in which we live, and also the mass. So this was kind of Cardijn's, you could say, theoretical response or explanation of the basis of the whole Cardijn inductive method. Now, I put in brackets there one more thing. If you look at the structure of that, Cardijn called it his dialectic. I didn't call it his dialectic. He called it a Christian dialectic in response to Marx's dialectic. And it's very interesting here. We don't really have time to go into this, but it's based on Proudhon. It's based on another French philosopher called Joseph Proudhon, who developed what he called a real ideal dialectic, in which the ideal and the real kind of are in contradiction. And therefore, there's a need for a method. Unlike Marx, who believed a revolution would solve every problem, Proudhon was convinced that this couldn't work. There was not a once-only solution. It was always going to be a continuing struggle to reconcile that contradiction between the ideal and the real. So you can see how the structure of Cardijn's Three Truths very much reflects the structure of Proudhon's dialectic, but look at the content also. It reflects very much Gratry's concepts. And over the next 30 years, through those specialised Catholic action movements that spread around the world, many of them became bishops, the early chaplains, many of them became bishops over the next 30 years. There were 250 of them by Vatican II. Amazingly, out of 2,500 bishops at the Second Vatican Council, at least 250 of them had passed through either the JOC or the JEC, one of the various specialised movements that came out of it at that time. And you can see John the 23rd picked it up and inserted it into his famous encyclical Mater Magistra, expressing the three stages as look, judge, and act. And we see it again in Apostolicam Actuositatem, where the formation aspect is emphasised and the prudential aspect is emphasised. People are learning through viewing, judging, and acting. They're learning to develop their prudential capacity in a Aristotelian and Thomistic sense to act within the world. And we see this even more so in the famous Pastoral Constitution Gaudium and Spes. The Cardijn Act was actually articulated as the method for drafting of that document. And part 2, in fact, is made up of 5 chapters, each of which is constructed as a Cardijn Act. Some of them, the chapter on culture in particular, if you look at it, you can see very clearly. The others, because each chapter was drafted by a different sub-commission and then compiled all together. And the actual final compiler was a guy called Pierre Hauptmann, who was also a Joseph's chaplain and also some of the adult Catholic, specialised Catholic action movements. Significantly, he also was a Proudhonian scholar. So you can see how even the structure of the whole thing reflects that Proudhonian, and he said it explicitly. He turned it around. Instead of starting with the truth of faith, he turned it around and put the truth of reality at the start. So it's a bottom-up Proudhonian dialectic, and we see the whole thing. You know, it recognises the whole signs of the time. Paragraph 4. The Church has always had the duty to scrutinise the signs of the times and interpret them in the light of the gospel. And then we see afterwards, Vatican II, Cardinal Paul Poupart, who became the head of the Pontifical Council for Culture, also a French priest as well. He explicitly recognises the inductive approach. Gaudium and Spes inaugurated a new way of addressing the world, an inductive method which began from the aspirations of the human being instead of a deductive method with a basis in revelation. So even though he doesn't name Gratry, actually, Poupart had actually studied the writings of Gratry, but it's a very clear recognition of the whole inductive process and connecting it to the whole history of the last 100 years that had gone before. Now, just as one last thing I will mention as well, which I actually discovered in the course of preparing this talk, I'm very happy to see it too. Another American philosopher, Jacob Wood from Steubenville, the Franciscan University. He was trying to trace the ressourcement that led up to the Second Vatican Council. And it's very interesting to see here, he also credits Gratry as one of the main sources of that ressourcement. And he actually connects Gratry to a philosophy derived from a guy called Giles of Rome, a 13th century philosopher who spoke about human nature desiring completion by grace, which in a sense is kind of quite similar. Maybe Claire might have some clarification or additions on this point. Sort of also anticipates the temporal, eternal sort of continuum that Cardijn and Gratry spoke about. So you see, Wood explains all this, how Gratry's scholastic Augustinianism was taken up by Maurice Blondel, a student of Gratry, and also a student of Ollie Leprune. Blondel was a disciple of Gratry, but also a direct student of Ollie Leprune. So they mediated this philosophy through to the Second Vatican Council, and including one of the main periti at the council, very much recognised today, the French Jesuit Henry de Lubac. And Wood explains how one of de Lubac's first articles rediscovered this Giles of Rome tradition that had inspired Gratry, and that had been mediated to him through Blondel. So I think this really kind of illustrates how it's not just even the C.J. Jack's inductive method that Vatican II derived from Cardijn, but that there's also a whole lot more that remains to be explored. So this is really the conclusion. You know, if we recognise, and it has been recognised, and Claire mentioned Newman, who is that contemporary of Gratry. Newman's today very much recognised as one of the precursors of Vatican II. And I'm very convinced myself that we have to see Gratry at least on a similar footing as an inspiration and a precursor of the Second Vatican Council. And I'll just finish with the beautiful tomb where he's buried after his kind of exile to where he died, to Switzerland at the end of his life. He was brought back to Paris to be buried in the Montparnasse cemetery, where I think it's a very humble epitaph that he's written. I don't know if he knew it was going to be his epitaph. I am the servant and the worshipper of truth, capital truth alone. And it's kind of nice to see too that monument was made by his own cousin, sculptor Marguerite de Béziers Gratry. So that's who Gratry was, a servant and a worshipper of truth, whose thought traversed the generations right through to Vatican II and beyond. Thank you very much.
Question, and probably for others. We've been going through this plenary council process here. People are starting to talk about synodality. But in the stuff I've read, both Stefan and Claire, I see very few references to the processes we're talking about here, C.J., that inductive method. And most of the conversation, in fact, seems to be about our identity in church, rather than our identity as Christians in the world, in the workplace, in the neighborhood. Would either or both of you like, and do other people have that sense? There's a number, I realize there are other people from other continents here, but certainly for us in Australia, we keep getting told that the Vatican is watching our plenary council and that other Episcopal conferences, etc., are watching. But I don't have a lot of confidence that the language that we are engaging in this session has permeated into the conversations in the plenary council. Does anyone want to respond to that? Anyone at all?
That was my experience. I participated in our parish level, and it was, what I liked best about it was the segment on the small groups. But there was a presentation video. There were several video presentations of our local bishop and the assistant bishop, and the spirituality that they communicated was this very devotional, personal, Jesus and me kind of spirituality. There was very little sense of the Eucharist being a dimension of social justice and community and going out to the world. It was very disappointing in that sense. But the community I belong to is very much oriented towards justice and the body of Christ and so on. So our small group was very supportive of that, but they all expressed this great sadness, really, that where are these bishops? I mean, of course, there, you know as well as I do that a third of the bishops in the United States are very against Pope Francis's work, and it's very disheartening. But I don't know, it's so different from the spirituality that really set me on fire when I was a teenager with this See Judge Act system, which we had at the Catholic Youth Center.
Cool. All right. Well, this, from my point of view, you know, this not only is the 150th anniversary of Gratry's death this year, but it's also the 60th anniversary of Vatican II. So I think it's a good time to be bringing this back, you know, reviving the church, our memories, and the church's memory of this. Yeah, I think it's very important. I certainly think the Australian Plenary Council, which is coming up, the second session, it's very similar to what you just said, Millicent. Yeah, well, that's my experience of it as well. And we are trying to bring that dimension back.
I also had the starting of my life with the Catholic Youth Center, and Millicent had mentioned, I was sorry everyone couldn't have heard it, in our small group, that it was Father Ballio and another priest that went over to Belgium, met with Cardinal Cardijn, and gave their whole life, starting in their 20s as priests, to this method. We never called it a method, and we never knew anything about that. But it was in stark contrast. I never thought of it until she mentioned it. Nothing like that was in our Catholic high school. But the Catholic Youth Center was our way of life, our spirituality, our everything. And everybody says the same thing that was part of that era. And Millicent said it better than I could, and she had more years in it than I did because it was starting. But there's been nothing on this word, even the word synodality seems to be something different, like everyone's trying to figure it out. Whereas I thought maybe using some words of Vatican II that we already knew might even have helped that. But there's been nothing in California here where I live to even have anything to do with that. We can't even have a group in our parish. So anyway, I don't want to go on and on, but it's a real need. And maybe we just have to be patient and keep trying to work at it.
Well, the other big question for me is, it's not just in the parishes. Why aren't we reaching the new generation of Catholic academics in our university? I'm looking at those who hold the theology chairs in Australian Catholic Uni and in Notre Dame, particularly here. It just seems there is a gap between the stuff they're delivering to students and the conversations we're having. Look at this audience, not only our age, but why don't we have anyone from ACU? And I presume no one here is from ACU or Notre Dame. But is that a valid question we should be asking?
Yeah, I think it is. What can I say? Yeah, I've tried many times to not promote, you know, like kind of see how we could, this kind of idea. But yeah, but at the same time, you have to admit they're very small university. I mean, well, the kind of theology and the philosophy departments are quite small. So it sort of takes time, a generational thing, to change the orientation. So that's certainly a thing. But we have to find a way. Well, that's why we created the Australian Cardijn Institute, because the Catholic universities aren't doing it. Well, we can at least do what we can. So, yeah.
May I make a comment? John Bamford in Brisbane.
Yes, Frank,
Sure.
go.
John Bamford. I'm not sure what we're all looking for as Catholics, but what we do know, without a doubt, that the world is looking to be engaged in a practical economy, one that produces the fruits that we pray for each day when we say, "Give us this day our daily bread." And the area that I have focused on is Spain, because we there have a practical demonstration of the implementation of the social teaching of the church at Mondragon Corporation. Now, I don't know whether other people know about that, but I, for one, am working on bringing that organisation to Brisbane.
Wow.
And it involves exciting the young people. And this was attempted many years ago through the YCW, but failed because of various issues. That's all I need to say.
John, as someone in Brisbane, I would be quite excited about that. And I suppose that's the other thing, Stefan. How do we, when John makes a suggestion like, how do we connect with each other? Are people at this gathering happy to share email contacts, for example, to either continue conversations? Yeah, there's a thumbs up there. Because I think the conversation obviously is going to go beyond our presence at this webinar. And so, Stefan, I suppose it's a bit of a challenge. How to set up a structure that can allow that?
Well, right now, like ACI, we're doing a Lenten program for the next. Well, we've done 2 weeks now. We've got 3 weeks left of Lent. So, but actually, Claire made a very interesting suggestion just a week or two ago, because while she was writing her talk today, you can just see how much further this whole thing could go. She suggested we should create a Gratry society, a sort of thing to take this thought further. But anyway, whatever, I'd be interested myself, even to get together with 3 or 4 or whoever, whatever number we might be. We could sort of meet together in, say, a month or something after Lent, after Easter, and just kind of discuss the next step, what we want to do, whether it's to take it in the Mondragon direction or whatever other ideas we might, or a more philosophical direction. But personally, I'd be interested to do that. So if anybody's happy, I'm very happy to facilitate that.
Yep.
John. Okay.
Thumbs up.
Thumbs up, even from the USA. Cool. We're going to have an intercontinental group. Yeah, excellent. Well, that's great. I know. Well, there are people doing stuff on the Mondragon thing, particularly in the USA, but also now in Victoria. The Earthworker Cooperative, I think, is David still here with us? I'm not sure if he is. Has been in contact with him. I have a little bit. And the USA, it's quite a developed Mondragon sort of, I won't say movement, but a number of groups starting cooperatives directly inspired and modelled on the Mondragon thing. Yeah, I think Mondragon's very, very important myself. Yeah.
Stefan, just the final thing to say on that. I'm in constant contact now with the Christian Foundation of Arizmendi, and I'm working through the process of finding some people in Brisbane that will actually become part of a cooperative in which I'm asking Mondragon to take a 50% interest.
All right.
Now,
well,
whether that all happens or not, I don't know, but that's where we are at the moment here.
Cool. Well, I'll follow up with you. Write me another email, John, and we can follow that up, let's say after Easter, if you don't mind. Des, who's in the audience here, you see Des Ryan. Des used to work for the old YCW cooperative back in Melbourne. So a few of us are kind of have a direct interest in that whole cooperative thing, yeah.
Stefan, I just wanted to share. I tried in my latest book, probably my last book, to share with the reader how I got into. It's not a book about YCW. It's a memoir. It's about 33 years of work I did for the city of Chicago. But in there, I share with the audience how I came upon a vocation, and that came very, very much through not only my family, but through the YCW. And that's in the book. And we came to—
There you go. I'm sharing the screen. I'm sharing the screen with everybody. Your book's on screen now, Frank.
Yeah, you can get the book.
That's your first book. That's your first book, I know. You got a new one now, haven't you? Yeah.
No, that's the new one.
Oh, that is the new one. Yeah.
You can
Okay.
get this book. You don't have to buy the book. You can get it in a Kindle. They're not as expensive ways to buy it than buying the book. Anyway, what I've tried to do through a couple of books is keep the story alive. That's one way I've tried. The other way is to keep moving along with Vatican II, as I board my small group with. But just my last comment I'd like to make is, one of the things I haven't heard mentioned is my experience has been as one of the reasons the movement doesn't exist any longer, with some small examples, is the chaplains we had in the 50s when I was active in the movement. Chaplains were dynamic. I think a lot of them were influenced by a guy by the name, not only Cardijn, but by Reynold Hillenbrand, Monsignor Reynold Hillenbrand, who was big on the social doctrine of the church. I never heard of it until I met him. In any event, we don't have those priests that come out of the seminary on fire like they did in the 50s.
Time here.
That's another thing we've got to do. That's another thing we've got to do, inspire a new generation. Sorry, who's going to talk? Yeah.
That's it.
Thank you.
Well, I'm just going to share my screen again with the Gratry book. So this is the book that Claire was instrumental in publishing, and I have to acknowledge ATF Press from Adelaide, Hilary Regan. Some of you might have met him at the Cincinnati conference from the USA, and others know him here. So he was the one that took on the job of publishing the book. So it is available there. And if you go to my Gratry website, you'll find the link through to get that too. But if anybody's interested to follow up in a philosophical sense, yeah, there's lots to study there.
And it was thanks to Stefan that it got published. It had been going to be published, and then they changed in the book, the deep suppression or depression, whatever we had. Anyway, thank you.
Well, I was a link person. You did all the work, and I just gave you Hilary's email.
I felt after that I could die peacefully.
What do you think? We had enough conversation? What do you reckon, Tony?
I think we might. I think people have done very well. I think, and yeah, it might be time to start winding down and giving people a chance to go and mull.
Right.
Just remind us of your URL, Stefan.
You mean my personal one?
That where the book and other things are posted is.
Oh yeah, Gratry.net, Gratry.net, Gratry.net.
Okay, great.
Yeah.
Yeah, I'm happy to call it a day. It's getting quite late at night here.
Yeah. Oh yeah, fair enough. Yeah. Well, thanks for coming, Ray. Good to see you. Yeah.
Thank you.
Well, look, Ray. Maybe the next 2 years we want to have one on Lebret. So Ray's an expert on another French Joseph-inspired guy and Laplace-inspired guy, Louis Joseph Lebret, who's the drafter of Popular and Progressio. So Ray, can we line you up for one of those talk on that sometime?
Yeah, certainly sometime. I also have direct Laplace connections through Geddes.
Yeah, that'll be a great follow-up.
Triangle.
When you're ready for it, Ray, we'll be ready. We'll be ready for it too. Yeah. Well, there's a lot of things to follow up, I think. So I don't know if anybody else has got anything they want to say, but I personally, from my point of view, I'd definitely like to thank Claire because wow, that's just great. That learning about Gratry, and I kind of feel, we've really got to take that further. And even more, I feel we've got to make Gratry more well known over the course of the 60th anniversary of Vatican II. Thank you. Anybody else? Last words?
I can finish with the C.J. Jack prayer.
Sure. Thank you, Brian. Yep.
And it's the YCS prayer that we use here in Australia and maybe somewhere else. Lord Jesus, fill us with your spirit of love. Help us to see the world as you do, to judge with your heart, and to act with the strength and courage you have shown us as we work to transform our world. Amen.
Yeah. Thank you, everybody.
Thank you, Brian. Yep. Thank you, everybody. Yeah.
Right, thank you.
You all get a gold Zoom star for your performance today. You all did very well.
And thank you, Tony. Thank you, Tony. Yes, very much. Always appreciate the technical side, which just really makes it happen. That's right. Yeah.
Thanks, Tony.
All right,
everyone. Good on you.
See you all later.
Bye.
Yeah. Bye-bye.
Bye.
Bye.
Bye.